Novel The Kite Runner by Khalid Hosseini, chapter number 16. Rahim Shah slowly uncrossed his legs and leaned against the bare wall in the very deliberate way of man whose every movement triggers spikes of pain. Outside, a donkey was braying and someone was shouting something in Urdu. The sun was beginning to set glittering red through the cracks between the ramshackle buildings. It hit me again the enormity of what I had done that winter and that following summer. The names rang in my head: Hassan, Sorab, Ali, Farzana, and Snowber. Hearing Rahim Khan speak Ali's name was like finding an old dusty music box that had not been opened in years. The melody began to play immediately. Who did you eat today, Babalu? Who did you eat? You slant eyed Babalu. I tried to conjure Ali's frozen face to really see his tranquil eyes, but time can be greedy thing. Sometimes it steals all the details for itself. Is Hassan still in that house now? I asked. Im Khan raised the teacup to his parched lips and took a sip. He then fished an envelope from the breast pocket of his vest and handed it to me. For you. I tore the sealed envelope. Inside I found a Polaroid photograph and a folded letter. I stared at the photograph for a full minute. A tall man dressed in a white turban and a green striped chapan stood with a little boy in front of a set of wrought iron gates. Sunlight slanted in from the left, casting a shadow on half of his rotund face. He was squinting and smiling at the camera, showing a pair of missing front teeth. Even in the blurry Polaroid, the man in the chapan exuded a sense of self assuredness of ease. It was in the way he stood, his feet slightly apart, his arms comfortably crossed on his chest, his head tilted a little toward the sun. Mostly it was in the way he smiled. Looking at the photo, one might have concluded that this was a man who thought the world had been good to him. Rahim Khan was right. I would have recognized him if I had bumped into him on the street. The little boy stood barefoot, one arm wrapped around the man's thigh, his shaved head resting against his father's hip. He too was grinning and squinting. I unfolded the letter. It was written in Farsi. No dots were omitted, no crosses forgotten, no words blurred together. The handwriting was almost childlike in its neatness. I began to read, In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, Amir Agha, with my deepest respect, Farzana Jan Sorab, and I pray that this latest letter finds you in good health and in the light of Allah's good graces. Please offer my warmest thanks to Rahim Khan Sahib for carrying it to you. I am hopeful that one day I will hold one of your letters in my hands and read of your life in America. Perhaps a photograph of you will even grace our eyes. I have told much about you to Farzana Jan and Sorab, about us growing up together and playing games and running in the streets. They laugh at the stories of all the mischief you and I used to cause. Amir Agha, alas, the Afghanistan of our youth is long dead. Kindness is gone from the land and you cannot escape the killings. Always the killings in Kabul. Fear is everywhere, in the streets, in the stadium, in the markets. It is the part of our lives here, Amir Agha. The savages who rule our Watan don't care about human decency. The other day, I accompanied Farzana Jan to the bazaar to buy some potatoes and naan. She asked the vendor how much the potatoes cost, but he did not hear her. I think he had a deaf ear, so she asked louder, and suddenly a young Talib ran over and hit her on the thighs with his wooden stick. He struck her too hard. She fell down. He was screaming at her and cursing and saying the Ministry of Vice and Virtue does not allow women to speak loudly. She had a large purple bruise on her leg for days, but what could I do except stand and watch my wife get beaten? If I fought, that dog would have surely put a bullet in me, and gladly. Then what I would happen to my Sohrab? The streets are full enough already of hungry orphans, and every day I thank Allah that I am alive, not because I fear death, but because my wife has a husband and my son is not an orphan. I wish you could see Sorab. He is good boy, Rahim Khan Saab, and I have taught him to read and write so he does not grow up stupid like his father. And can he shoot with that slingshot. I take Sorab around Kabul sometimes and buy him candy. There is still a monkey man in Share now, and if we run into him, I pray him to make his monkey dance for Sorab. You should see how he laughs. The two of us often walks up to the cemetery on the hill. Do you remember how we used to sit under the pomegranate tree there and read from the Shahnama? The drought have dried the hill and the trees has not borne fruit in years, but Sorab and I still sit under its shade and I read to him from Shahnama. It is not necessary to tell you that his favorite part is the one with his namesake Rustam and Sorab. Soon he will be able to read from the book himself. I am very proud and very lucky father. Amir Agha Rahim Khan Sahib is quite ill. He coughs all the day and I see blood on his sleeve when he wipes his mouth. He has lost much weight and I wish he would eat a little of the shorva and rice that Farzana Jan cooks for him, but he only takes a bite or two, and even that I think is out of courtesy to Farzana Jan. I am so worried about this dear man. I pray for him every day. He is leaving for Pakistan in a few days to consult some doctor there, and inshallah he will return with good news. But in my heart I fear for him. Farzana Jan and I have told little Sorab that Rahim Khan Sahib is going to be well. What can we do? He is only 10 and he adores Rahim Khan Sahib. They have grown so close to each other. Rahim Khan Sahib used to take him to bazaar for balloons and biscuits, but he is too weak for that now. I have been dreaming a lot lately, Amir Agha. Some of them are nightmares, like hanged corpses rotting in soccer fields with blood red grass. I wake up from those short of breath and sweetie. Mostly though I dream of good things and praise Allah for that. I dream that Rahim Khan Sahib will be well. I dream that my son will grow up to be a good person, a free person and important person. I dream that lavla flowers will bloom in the streets of Kabul again, and robab music will play in the samovar houses and kites will fly in the skies. And I dream that someday you will return to Kabul, revisit the land of our childhood. If you do, you will find an old faithful friend waiting for you. May Allah be with you always. Hassan. I read the letter twice. I folded the note and looked at the photograph for another minute. I pocketed both. How is he? I asked. That letter was written 6 months ago. A few days before I left for Peshawar, Rahim Khan said, I took the Polaroid the day before I left. A month after I arrived in Peshawar, I received a call from one of my neighbors in Kabul. He told me this story. Soon after I took my leave, a rumor spread that a Hazara family was living alone in the big house in Wazira Khan, or so the Taliban claim. A pair of Taliban officials came in to investigate and interrogated Hassan. They accused him of lying when Hassan told them he was living with me, even though many of the neighbors, including the one who called me, supported Hassan's story. The Talib said he was a liar and a thief like other Hazaras and ordered him to get his family out of the house by sundown. Hassan protested, but my neighbor said the Talibs were looking at the big house like, how did he say it? Yes, like wolves looking at a flock of sheep. They told Hassan they would be moving in, supposedly keep it safe until I returned. Hassan protested again, so they took him to the street. No, I breathed, and ordered him to kneel. No, God, no, and shot him in the back of the head. Farzana came screaming and attacked them. No, shot her too. Self-defense, they claimed later, but all I could manage was to whisper no, 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 over and over again. I kept thinking of that day in 1974 in the hospital room. Just after Hassan's hair lift surgery, Baba Rahim Khan Ali and I had huddled around Hassan's bed, watched him examine his new lip in a handheld mirror. Now everyone in that room was either dead or dying except for me. I saw something else, a man dressed in a herringbone vest pressing the muzzle of his Kalashnikov to the back of Hassan's head. The blast echoes through the street of my father's house. Hassan slumps on the asphalt, his life of unrequited loyalty drifting from him like the wind-blown kites he used to chase. The Taliban moved into the house, Rahim Khan said. The pretext was that they had evicted a Trespasser. Hassan's and Farzana's murders were dismissed as a case of self-defense. No one said a word about it. Most of it was fear of the Taliban, I think, but no one was going to risk anything for a pair of Hazara's servants. What did they do with Sohrab? I asked. I felt tired, drained. A coughing fit gripped Rahim Khan and went on for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face was flushed and his eyes bloodshot. I heard he's in an orphanage somewhere in Courtesy, Amir Jan. Then he was coughing again. When he stopped, he looked older than a few moments before, like he was aging with each coughing fit. Amir Jan, I summoned you here because I wanted to see you before I die, but that's not all. I said nothing. I think I already knew what he was going to say. I want you to go to Kabul. I want you to bring Sorab here, he said. I struggled to find the right words. I would barely had time to deal with the fact that Hassan was dead. Please hear me. I know an American pair here in Peshawar, a husband and wife named Thomas and Betty Caldwell. They are Christians and they run a small charity organization that they manage with private donations. Mostly they house and feed Afghan children who have lost their parents. I have seen the place. It's clean and safe. The children are well cared for, and Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell are kind people. They have already told me that Sorab would be welcome to their home. And Rahim, you can't be serious. Children are fragile, Amir Jan. Kabul is already full of broken children, and I don't want Sorab to become another. Rahim Khan, I don't want to go to Kabul. I can't, I said. Sorab is a gifted little boy. We can give him a new life here, new hope with people who would love him. Thomas Aga is a good man, and Betty Khanum is a kind. You should see how she treats those orphans. Why me? Why can't you pay someone here to go? I will pay for it if it's a matter of money. It is not about money, Amir, Rahim Khan roared. I am dying, man, and I will not be insulted. It has never been about money with me. You know that. And why you? I think we both know why it has to be you, don't we? I don't want to understand that comment, but I did. I understood it all too well. I have a wife in America, a home, a career, and a family. Kabul is a dangerous place, you know that, and you would have me risk everything for. I stopped. You know, Rahim Khan said, one time when you were not around, your father and I were talking, and you know how he always worried about you in those days. I remember he said to me, Rahim, a boy who won't stand up for himself becomes a man who can't stand up to anything. I wonder, is that what you have become? I dropped my eyes. What I am asking from you is to grant an old man his dying wish, he said gravely. He had gambled with that comment, played his best cards or so. I thought then his words hung in limbo between us, but at least he had known what to say. I was still searching for the right words, and I was the writer in the room. Finally, I settled for this. Maybe Baba was right. I am sorry you think that, Amir. I could not look at him, and you don't. If I did, I would not have asked you to come here. I toyed with my wedding ring. You have always thought too highly for me, Rahim Khan, and you have always been far too hard on yourself. He hesitated. But there's something else, something you don't know. Please, Rahim Khan, Snowball was not Ali's first wife. Now I looked up. He was married once before to a Hazara woman from the Jaghori area. This was long before you were born. They were married for 3 years. What does this have to do with anything? She left him childless after 3 years and married a man in Khost. She bore him 3 daughters. That's what I am trying to tell you. I began to see where he was going, but I didn't want to hear the rest of it. I had a good life in California, pretty Victorian home with a peaked roof, a good marriage, a promising writing career, in laws who loved me. I didn't need any of this shit. Ali was royal. Rahim Khan said. No, he wasn't. He and Snowball had Hassan, didn't they? They had Hassan. No, they didn't, Rahim Khan said. Yes, they did. No, they didn't, Amir. Then who? I think you know who. I felt like a man sliding down a steep cliff, clutching at shrubs and tangles of brambles and coming up empty-handed. The room was swooping up and down, swaying side to side. Did Hassan know? I said through lips that didn't feel like my own. Rahim Khan closed his eyes, shook his head. You bastards, I muttered, stood up. You goddamn bastards! I screamed, all of you, you bunch of lying goddamn bastards. Please sit down, Rahim Khan said. How could you hide this from me? From him, I bellowed. Please think, Amir Jan, it was a shameful situation. People would talk. All that a man had back then, all that he was his honor, was his name. And if people talked, we could not tell anyone. Surely you can see that. He reached for me, but I shut his hand, headed for the door. Amir Jan, please don't leave. I opened the door and turned to him. Why? What can you possibly say to me? I am 38 years old and I have just found out my whole life is one big fucking lie. What can you possibly say to make things better? Nothing. Not a goddamn things. And with that, I stormed out of the apartment. Chapter number 18. The sun had almost set and left the sky swept in smothers of purple and red. I walked down the busy narrow street that led away from Rahim Khan's building. The street was a noisy lane in a maze of alleyways choked with pedestrians, bicycles, and rickshaws. Billboards hung at its corners advertising Coca-Cola and cigarettes. Hollywood movie posters displayed sultry actresses dancing with the handsome brown-skinned men in fields of marigolds. I walked into a smoky little farm-over house and ordered a cup of tea. I tilted back on the folding chair's rear legs and rubbed my face. That feeling of sliding towards the fall was fading, but in its stead, I felt like a man who awakens in his own house and finds all the furniture rearranged so that every familiar nook and the cranny looks foreign now. Disoriented, he has to reevaluate his surroundings, reorient himself. How could I have been so blind? The sign had been there for me to see all along. They came flying back at me now. Baba hiring Dr. Kumar to fix Hassan's hair lip. Baba never missing Hassan's birthday. I remember the day we were planting tulips when I had asked Baba if he had ever considered getting new servants. Hassan is not going anywhere. He had barked. He's staying right here with us where he belongs. This is his home and we are his family. We had wept when Ali announced he and Hassan were leaving us. The waiter placed a teacup on the table before me. Where the table's legs crossed like an X, there was a ring of brass balls, each walnut size. One of the balls had come unscrewed. I stooped and tightened it. I wish I could fix my own life as easily. I took up a gulp of the blackest tea I would had in years and tried to think of Suraya, of the journal and Khala Jamila, of the novel that needed finishing. I tried to watch the traffic bolting by on the street, the people miling in and out of the little sweet shops, tried to listen to the Qawwali music playing on the transistor radio at the next table. Anything but I kept seeing Baba on the night of my graduation sitting in the fort he had just given me smelling of beer and saying, I wish Hassan had been with us today. How could he have lied to me all those years? To Hassan, he had sat me on his lap and I was little, looked me straight in the eyes and said, there is only one sin, and that is theft. When you tell a lie, you steal someone right to the truth. Hadn't he said those words to me? And now, 15 years after I had buried him, I was learning that Baba had been a thief, and a thief of the worst kind, because the things he had stolen had been sacred. From me, the right to know I had a brother, from Hassan his identity, and from Ali his honor, his nang, his namus. The questions kept coming at me. How had Baba brought himself to look Ali in the eye? How had Ali lived in that house day in and day out, knowing he had been dishonored by his master in the single worst way and one man can be dishonored? And how was I going to reconcile this new image of Baba with the one that had been imprinted on my mind for so long, that of him in his old brown suit hobbling up the Tahiri's driveway to ask for Suraya's hand? Here is another cliche my creative writing teacher would have scoffed at. Like father, like son, but it was true, wasn't it? As it turned out, Baba and I were more alike than I would ever known. We had both betrayed the people who would have given their lives for us, and with that came this realization that Rahim Khan had summoned me here to atone not just for my sins but for Baba's too. Rahim Khan said I would always been too hard on myself, but I wondered true. I had not made Ali step on the landmine, and I had not brought the Taliban to the house to shoot Hassan, but I had driven Hassan and Ali out of the house. Was it too far fetched to imagine that things might have turned out differently? If I had not, maybe Baba would have brought them along to America. Maybe Hassan would have had a home of his own now, a job, family, a life in a country where no one cared that he was a Hazara, where most people didn't even know what a Hazara was. Maybe not, but maybe so. I can't go to Kabul, I had said to Rahim Khan. I have a wife in America, a home, a career, and a family, but how could I pack up and go back home when my actions may have cost Hassan a chance at those very same things? I wished Rahim Khan had not called me. I wish he had let me live on in my oblivion. But he had called me, and what Rahim Khan revealed to me changed things, made me see how my entire life long before the winter of 1975, dating back to when Dad's singing Hazara woman was still nursing me, had been a cycle of lies, betrayals, and secrets. There is a way to be good again, he had said, a way to end the cycle, with a little boy and orphan Hassan's son somewhere in Kabul. On the rickshaw ride back to Rahim Khan's apartment, I remembered Baba saying that my problem was that someone had always done my fighting for me. I was 38 now, my hair was receding and streaked with grey, and lately I had traced little crow's feet it around the corners of my eyes. I was older now, but maybe not yet too old to start doing my own fighting. Baba had lied about a lot of things that turned out, but he had not lied about that. I looked at the round face in the Polaroid again, the way the sun fell on it, my brother's face. Hassan had loved me once, loved me in a way that no one ever had or ever would again. He was gone now, but a little part of him lived on. It was in Kabul waiting. I found Rahim Khan praying namaz in a corner of the room. He was just a dark silhouette bowing eastward against a blood red sky. I waited for him to finish. Then I told him I was going to Kabul, told him to call the Caldwells in the morning. I will pray for you, Amir Jan, he said. Chapter number 19. Again the car sickness. By the time we drove past the bullet-riddled sign that read, "The Khyber Pass welcomes you," my mouth had begun to water. Something inside my stomach churned and twisted. Farid, my driver, threw me a cold glance. There was no empathy in his eyes. "Can we roll down the window?" I asked. He lit a cigarette and tucked it between the remaining two fingers of his left hand, the one resting on the steering wheel. Keeping his black eyes on the road, he stooped forward, picked up the screwdriver laying between his feet, and handed it to me. I stuck it in the small hole in the door where the handle belonged and turned it to roll down my window. Farid gave me another dismissive look, this one with a hint of barely suppressed animosity, and went back to smoking his cigarette. He had not said more than a dozen words since we had departed from the Jamrud fort. "Kur," I muttered. I leaned my head out of the window and let the cold mid-afternoon air rush past my face. The drive through the tribal lands of the Khyber Pass, winding between cliffs of shale and limestone, was just as I remembered it. Baba and I had driven through the broken terrain back in 1974. The arid, imposing mountains sat along deep gorges and soared to jagged peaks. Old fortress, adobe walled and crumbling top the crags. I tried to keep my eye glued to the snow-capped Hindu Kush on the north side, but each time my stomach settled even a bit, the truck skidded around yet another turn, rousing a fresh wave of nausea. "Try a lemon." "What?" "Lemon good for the sickness," Farid said. "I always bring one for this drive." "Nah, thank you," I said. The merely thought of adding acidity to my stomach stirred more nausea. Farid snickered. It's not fancy like American medicine. I know, just an old remedy my mother taught me. I regretted blowing my chance to warm up to him. In that case, maybe you should give me some. He grabbed a paper bag from the back seat and plucked a half lemon out of it. I bit down on it, waited a few minutes. You were right, I feel better. I lied. As an Iguan, I knew it was better to be miserable than rude. I forced a weak smile. Old Watani tricks, no need for fancy medicine, he said. His tone bordered on the surly. He flicked the ash off his cigarette and gave himself a self-satisfied look in the rear view mirror. He was a Tajik, a lanky dark man with a weather-beaten face, narrow shoulders, and a long neck, punctuated by a protruding Adam's apple that only peeked from behind his beard when he turned his head. He was dressed much as I was, though I suppose it was really the other way around. A rough woven wool blanket wrapped over a grey pirhan turban and a vest. On his head he wore a brown pakol tilted slightly to one side, like the Tajik hero Ahmad Shah Massoud, referred to by Tajiks as the line of Pancher. It was Rahim Khan who had introduced me to the Farid in Peshawar. He told me and Farid was 29, though he had the very lined face of a man 20 years older. He was born in Mazar-e-Sharif and lived there until his father moved the family to Jalalabad when Farid was 10. At 14, he and his father had joined the jihad against the Shoravi. They had fought in the Panjshir Valley for the 2 years until helicopter gunfire had torn the older man to pieces. Farid had two wives and 5 children. He used to have 7. Rahim Khan said with a rueful look, but he had lost his 2 youngest girls a few years earlier in a landmine blast just outside the Jalalabad, the same explosion that had severed toes from his feet and 3 fingers from his left hand. After that, he had moved his wives and children to Peshawar. Checkpoint, Farid grumbled. I slumped a little in my seat, arms folded across my chest, forgetting for a moment about the nausea. But I need not have worried. 2 Pakistani military approached our dilapidated Land Cruiser, took a cursory glance inside, and waved us on. Farid was one on the list of preparations. Rahim Khan and I made a list that included exchanging dollars for Kaldar and Afghani bills, my garment and pakol. Ironically, I had never worn either when I would actually lived in Afghanistan. The Polaroid of Hassan and Sorab, and finally, perhaps the most important item, an artificial beard, black and chest length, Sharia friendly, or at least the Taliban version of Sharia. Rahim Khan knew of a fellow in Peshawar who specialized in weaving them, sometimes for Western journalists who had covered the war. Rahim Khan had wanted me to stay with him a few more days to plan more thoroughly, but I knew I had to leave as soon as possible. I was afraid I could change my mind. I was afraid I would deliberate, ruminate, agonize, rationalize, and talk myself into not going. I was afraid the appeal of my life in America would draw me back, that I would wade back into that great big river and let myself forget, let the things I had learned these last few days sink to the bottom. I was afraid that I would let the waters carry me away from what I had to do, from Hassan, from the past that had come calling, and from this one last chance at redemption. So I left before there was any possibility of that happening. As for Suraya, telling her I was going back to Afghanistan was not an option. If I had, she would have booked herself on the next flight to Pakistan. We had crossed the border and the signs of poverty were everywhere. On either side of the road, I saw chains of little villages sprouted here and there like discarded toys among the rocks, broken mud houses and huts consisting of a little more than 4 wooden poles and a tattered cloth as a roof. I saw children dressed in a rags, chasing a soccer ball outside the huts. A few miles later, I spotted a cluster of men sitting on their haunches like a row of crows on the carcass of an old burned out Soviet tank, the wind fluttering the edges of the blankets thrown around them. Behind them, a woman in a brown burqa carried a large clay pot on her shoulder down a rutted path towards a string of mud houses. Strange, I said. What? I feel like a tourist in my own country, I said, taking in a goat herd leading a half dozen emaciated goats along the side of the road. Farid snickered, tossed his cigarette. You still think of this place as your country? I think a part of me always will, I said more defensively than I had intended. After 20 years of living in America, he said, swerving the truck to avoid a pothole the size of a beach ball. I nodded. I grew up in Afghanistan. Farid snickered again. Why do you do that? Never mind, he murmured. No, I want to know. Why do you do that? In his rear view mirror, I saw something flash in his eyes. You want to know? He sneered. Let me imagine, Agha Sahib, you probably lived in a big 2 or 3 story house with a nice backyard that your garden filled with flowers and fruit trees. I'll get it, of course. Your father drove an American car. You had servants, probably Hazaras. Your parents hired workers to decorate the house for the fancy mehmanis. They threw a so their friends would come over to drink and boast about their travels to Europe or America. And I would bet my first son's eyes that this is the first time you have ever worn a pakol. He grinned at me, revealing a mouthful of prematurely rotting teeth. Am I close? Why are you saying these things? I said. Because you wanted to know. He spat. He pointed to an old man dressed in ragged clothes, trudging down a dirt path, a large burlap bag filled with scrub grass tied to his back. That's the real Afghanistan, Agha Sahib. That's the Afghanistan I know. You have always been a tourist here. You just didn't know it. Rahim Khan had warned me not to accept a warm welcome in Afghanistan from those who had stayed behind and fought the war. I am sorry about your father, I said. I am sorry about your daughters, and I am sorry about your hand. That means nothing to me, he said. He shook his head. Why are you coming back here anyway? Sell off your Baba's land, pocket the money, and run back to your mother in America. My mother died giving birth to me, I said. He sighed and lit another cigarette. Said nothing. Pull over. What? Pull over. God damn it, I said. I am going to be sick. I tumbled out of the truck at it was coming to a rest on the gravel alongside the road. By late afternoon, the terrain had changed from one of sun-beaten peaks and barren cliffs to a greener, more rural landscape. The main pass had descended from Landi Kotal through Shinwari territory to Landi Khana. We had entered Afghanistan at Turkham. Pine trees flanked the road, fewer than I remembered, and many of them bare, but it was good to see trees again after the arduous drive through the Khyber Pass. We were getting closer to Jalalabad, where Farid had a brother who would take us in for the night. The sun had not quite set when we drove into Jalalabad, capital of the state of Nagarhar, a city once renowned for its fruit and warm climate. Farid drove past the building and stone houses of the city's central district. There were not as many palm trees there as I remembered, and some of the homes had been reduced to roofless walls and piles of the twisted clay. Farid turned onto a narrow, unpaved road and parked the Land Cruiser along a dried up gutter. I slid out of the truck, stretched, and took a deep breath. In the old days, the wind swept through the irrigated plains around Jalalabad, where farmers grew sugarcane and impregnated the city's air with a sweet scent. I closed my eyes and searched for the sweetness. I didn't find it. Let's go, Farid said impatiently. We walked up the dirt road past a few leafless poplars along a row of broken mud walls. Farid led me to a dilapidated one-story house and knocked on the wood plank door. A young woman with ocean green eyes and a white scarf draped around her face peeked out. She saw me first, flinched, spotted Farid, and her eyes lit up. Salam alaikum, Kaka Farid. Salam Mariam Jan. Farid replied and gave her something. He had denied me all day. A warm smile. He planted a kiss on the top of her head. The young woman stepped out of the way, eyeing me a little apprehensively as I followed Farid into a small house. The adobe ceiling was low, the dirt was entirely bare, and the only light came from a pair of lanterns set in a corner. We took off our shoes and stepped on the straw mat that covered the floor. Along one of the walls sat three young boys cross-legged on a mattress covered with a blanket with shredded powders. A tall, bearded man with broad shoulders stood up to greet us. Farid, and he hugged and kissed on the cheek. Farid introduced him to me as a Wahid, his older brother. He's from America, he said to Wahid, flicking his thumb toward me. He left us alone and went to greet the boys. Wahid sat with me against the wall across from the boys who had ambushed Farid and climbed his shoulder. Despite my protest, Wahid ordered one of the boys to fetch another blanket so I would be more comfortable on the floor and asked Mariam to bring me some tea. He asked about the ride from the Peshawar, the drive over the Khyber Pass. I hope you didn't come across my any dozed, he said. The Khyber Pass was as famous for its terrain as for the bandits who used that terrain to rob travelers. Before I could answer, he winked and said in loud voice, "Of course, no dogs would waste his time on a car as ugly as my brother's." Farid wrestled the smallest of the three boys to floor and tickled him on the ribs with his good hand. The kid giggled and kicked. "At least I have a car," Farid panted. "How is your donkey these days?" "My donkey is better right than your car." "Khara khara mishanash." Farid shot back. "Takes a donkey to know a donkey." They all laughed and I joined in. I heard female voices from the adjoining room. I could see half the room from where I sat. Mariam and an older woman wearing a brown hijab, presumably her mother, were speaking in low voices and pouring tea from a kettle into a pot. "So what do you do in America, Amir Agha?" Wahid asked. "I am a writer," I said. I thought I heard Farid chuckles at that. "A writer," Wahid said, clearly impressed. "Do you write about Afghanistan?" "Well, I have, but not currently," I said. "My last novel, A Season for Ashes, had been about a university professor who joins a clan of gypsies after he finds his wife in bed with one of his students. It was not a bad. Some reviewers had called it a good book, and one had even used the word riveting, but suddenly I was embarrassed by it. I hope Wahid would not ask what it was about. "Maybe you should write about Afghanistan again," Wahid said. "Tell the rest of the world what the Taliban are doing to our country." "Well, I am not quite that kind of writer." "Oh," Wahid said, nodding and blushing a bit. "You know best, of course. It's not for me to suggest." Just then Mariam and the other woman came into the room with a pair of cups and a tea pot on a small platter. I stood up in the respect, pressed my hand to my chest and bowed my head. "Salaam alaikum," I said. The woman, who had now wrapped her hijab to conceal her lower face, bowed her head too. "Salam," she replied in a barely audible voice. We never made eye contact. She poured the tea while I stood. The woman placed the steaming cup of tea before me and exited the room, her bare feet making no sound at all. As she disappeared, I sat down and sipped the strong black tea. Wahid finally broke the uneasy silence that followed. "So what brings you back to Afghanistan? What brings them all back to Afghanistan, dear brother?" Farid said, speaking to Wahid but fixing me with a contemptuous gaze. "Bus," Wahid snapped. "It's always the same thing," Farid said. "Sell this land, sell that house, collect the money, and run away like a mouse. Go back to America, spend the money on a family vacation on to Mexico." "Farid," Wahid roared. His children and even Farid flinched. "Have you forgotten your manners? This is my house. Amir Agha is my guest tonight and I will not allow you to dishonor me like this." Farid opened his mouth, almost said something, reconsidered and said nothing. He slumped against the wall, muttered something under his breath and crossed his mutilated foot over the good one. His accusing eyes never left me. "Forgive us, Amir Agha," he said. Since childhood, my brother's mouth has been two steps ahead of his head." "It's my fault, really," I said, trying to smile under Farid's intense gaze. "I am not offended. I should have explained to him my business here in Afghanistan. I am not here to sell property. I am going to Kabul to find a boy." "A boy?" Wahid repeated. "Yes," I fished the Polaroid from the pocket of my shut. Seeing Hassan's picture again tore the fresh scab of his death. I had to turn my eyes away from it. I handed it to Wahid. He studied the photo, looked from me to the photo, and back again. This boy, I nodded. This Hazara boy, yes. What does he mean to you? His father meant a lot to me. He is the man in the photo. He is dead now. Wahid blinked. He was a friend of yours? My instinct was to say yes, as if on some deep level I too wanted to protect Baba's secret, but there had been enough lies already. He was my half brother. I swallowed, added, my illegitimate half brother. I turned the teacup, toyed with the handle. I didn't mean to pray. You are not praying, I said. What will you do with him? Take him back to Peshawar. There are people there who will take care of him. Wahid handed the photo back and rested his thick hand on my shoulder. You are an honorable man, Agha. A true Afghan. I cringed inside. I am proud to have you in our home tonight, Wahid said. I thanked him and chanced a glance over to Farid. He was looking down now, playing with the frayed edges of the straw mat. A short while later, Mariam and her mother brought two steaming bowls of vegetable shorva and two loaves of bread. I am sorry we can't offer you meat, Wahi said. Only the Taliban can afford meat now. This looks wonderful, I said. It did too. I offered some to him to the kids, but Wahi said the family had eaten before we arrived. Farid and I rolled up our sleeves, dipped our bread in the shorva, and ate with our hands. As I ate, I noticed Wahid's boys, all three thin with dirt-caked faces and short cropped brown hair under their skull caps, stealing furtive glances at my digital wristwatch. The youngest whispered something in his brother's ear. The brother nodded, didn't take his eyes off my watch. The oldest of the boys, I guessed his age at about 12, rocked back and forth, his gaze glued to my wrist. After dinner, after I had washed my hands with the water Mariam poured from a clay pot, I asked for Wahid's permission to give boys a hadiah, a gift. He said no, but when I insisted, he reluctantly agreed. I unsnapped the wristwatch and gave it to the youngest of the three boys. He muttered a sheepish tashakkur. It tells you the time in any city in the world, I told him. The boys nodded politely, passing the watch between them, taking turns trying to it on, but they lost interest and soon the watch sat abandoned on the straw mat. You could have told me, Farid said later. The two of us were laying next to each other on the straw mats Wahid's wife had spread for us. Told you what? Why you have come to Afghanistan? His voice has lost the rough edge. I had heard in it since the moment I had met him. You didn't ask, I said. You should have told me. You didn't ask. He rolled to face me, curled his arm under his head. Maybe I will help you to find this boy. Thank you, Farid, I said. It was wrong of me to assume. I sighed. Don't worry, you were more right than you know. His hands are tied behind him with roughly woven rope cutting through the flesh of his wrist. He is blindfolded with black cloth. He is kneeling on the street on the edge of a gutter filled with still water, his head drooping between his shoulders. His knees roll on the hard ground and bleed through his pants as he rocks in prayers. It is late afternoon and his long shadow sways back and forth on the gravel. He is muttering something under his breath. I step closer. 1,000 times over he mutters for you. A thousand times over, back and forth he rocks. He lifts his face. I see a faint scar above his upper lip. We are not alone. I see the barrel first, then the man standing behind him. He is tall, dressed in a herringbone vest and a black turban. He looks down at the blindfolded man before him with eyes that show nothing but a waste, cowardice, emptiness. He takes a step back and raises the barrel, places it on the back of the kneeling man's head. For a moment, fading sunlight catches in the metal and the twinkles. The rifle roars with a deafening crack. I follow the barrel on its upward arc. I see the face behind the plume of smoke swirling from the muzzle. I am the man in the herringbone vest. I woke up with a scream trapped in my throat. I stepped outside, stood in the silver tarnish of a half moon, and glanced up to a sky riddled with stars. Crickets chirped in the shuttered darkness, and a wind wafted through the trees. The ground was cool under my bare feet, and suddenly, for the first time since we had crossed the border, I felt like I was back. After all these years, I was home again, standing on the soil of my ancestors. This was the soil on which my great grandfather had married his third wife a year before dying in the cholera epidemic that hit Kabul in 1915. She had borne him what his first two wives had failed to, a son at last. It was on this soil that my grandfather had gone on a hunting trip with King Nadir Shah and shot a deer. My mother had died on this soil, and on this soil I had fought for my father's love. I sat against one of the house clay walls. The kinship I felt suddenly for the old land, it surprised me. I had been gone long enough to forget and be forgotten. I had a home in a land that might as well be in an other galaxy to the people sleeping on the other side of the wall. I leaned against. I thought I had forgotten about this land, but I hadn't. And under the bony glow of a half moon, I sensed Afghanistan humming under my feet. Maybe Afghanistan had not forgotten me either. I looked westward and marveled that somewhere over those mountains Kabul still existed. It really existed, not just as an old memory or as the heading of an app story on page 15 of the San Francisco Chronicle. Somewhere over those mountains in the west slept the city where my hair-lived brother and I had run kites. Somewhere over there the blindfolded man from my dream had died a needless death. Once over those mountains, I had made a choice, and now, a quarter of a century later, that choice had landed me right back on this soil. I was about to go back inside when I heard voices coming from the house. I recognized one as Wahid. Nothing left for the children. We are hungry, but we are not savages. He is a guest. What was I supposed to do? He said in a strained voice. To find something tomorrow. She sounded near tears. What do I feel? I tiptoed away. I understood now why the boys hadn't shown an interest in the watch. They had not been staring at the watch at all. They had been staring at my food. We said our goodbyes early the next morning, just before I climbed into the Land Cruiser. I thanked Wahid for his hospitality. He pointed to the little house behind him. This is your home, he said. His three sons were standing in the doorway watching us. The little one was wearing the watch. It dangled around his twiggy wrist. I glanced in the side view mirror as we pulled away, where he stood surrounded by his boys in a cloud of dust whipped by the truck. It occurred to me that in different world those boys would not have been too hungry to chase after the car. Earlier that morning when I was certain no one was looking, I did something I had done 26 years earlier. I planted a fistful of crumpled money under a mattress.